My story, it's real, and it's about my wife's infidelity and how it affected a lifelong relationship. Now, I'm asking for some advice. After all this, am I out of my mind for wanting to give it another shot? And is it even worth it now that I'm 60? I've read a lot of stories, and many of them are heartbreaking, really hard to get through. My story has its own share of pain, but I don't think I can express the same level of betrayal that some other folks have written about. Mine is certainly sad, but maybe it offers a different outlook, something that could be worth hearing. I'm not entirely sure why I'm revisiting these events from so many years ago, but maybe it's just to show that, over time, good things can still happen. It seems that with enough patience, time really can heal most wounds. I know this is a bit long, but I feel like the background is important to help people grasp what really went down. That leads me back to my question. Am I crazy for wanting to give it another try? And is it worth doing at 60? I met my wife, and we were together for nearly a decade, 7 of those years as a married couple. We have 2 kids, both grown up now, with lives of their own. We actually met on a blind date, and to be honest, it was awkward from start to finish. My wife, let's call her Lisa, was always striking with a big, lively personality. Me? Well, I've always been more reserved, not the type to turn heads. I'm not a bad-looking guy, but I've never claimed to be a heartthrob either. I'm quiet by nature, while Lisa has always been the one who stands out at parties, the one people naturally gravitate toward. She's got a good heart, too, very empathetic and always seeing the best in others. For reasons I didn't quite understand, she liked me, and slowly but surely, our relationship grew. Eventually, we got married and began building our life together. Honestly, things were going well. We had a nice house, stable finances, great support from both our families, close friends, and our kids were thriving. But like in so many stories, there's often that one moment that changes everything. For us, that moment was when we decided to have another child. At the time, we had 2 young ones already and thought adding a third would make our family even happier. We never really had issues in the bedroom, and soon enough, we found out that baby number 3 was on the way. I was over the moon when Lisa shared the news. We kept it to ourselves for about 3 months, just letting it sink in before we told our families. During that time, we were busy planning, getting the nursery ready, preparing the kids for their new sibling, and sorting out the finances. Then came what I'll always remember as one of the darkest days of my life. Lisa called me and said, "Something's wrong with the baby." We rushed to the hospital, but tragically, she had a miscarriage at 6 months. It was devastating. The ride home the next day was just complete silence, a crushing sadness hanging over both of us. That night, Lisa went to bed and didn't come out of the room for 3 days. She was overwhelmed with grief and sank into a deep depression. For some reason, she also convinced herself that she had failed me as a wife. I kept telling her, again and again, that it wasn't her fault, that this was just something beyond our control, and that we could try again when the time was right. But she couldn't hear me. She kept blaming herself for what happened and just spiraled deeper into that depression. It took about 6 months, but slowly, she seemed to emerge from the darkness. Things started to feel normal again. We were both doing well with the kids, and her old spark was coming back. She began exercising, getting back in shape, and honestly, she looked amazing. I made sure to tell her often how beautiful she was and how much I loved her. During this time, Lisa brought up the idea of getting a part-time job. It wasn't really about the money. It was more of a way for her to get out of the house and stay active. I thought it was a great idea and encouraged her to figure out what she wanted to do and go for it. To my surprise, she ended up getting a job as a waitress and bartender at a restaurant just down the street from us. Even though she had a business degree, she didn't want a typical office job. She felt that juggling a corporate position with our home life and kids would be too much. This job, though, would get her out of the house, give her something to do, and let her earn a bit of money for herself. Plus, she said she really needed to be around other adults and have conversations that didn't revolve around the kids or the house. I thought it sounded like a good move and told her to go for it. Now, as I've mentioned before, Lisa is an attractive woman. She's also quite curvy, and with all the working out she'd been doing, she looked amazing. She's never had any trouble catching the attention of men, but she had always been loyal to me, and I never had any reason to question that. She started working, and things seemed to be going well. She usually worked 2 or 3 nights a week, often on Fridays or Saturdays. I'll admit, I wasn't entirely comfortable with her work outfits. They showed off her figure more than I would have liked. They were tasteful enough, but I did wish she'd dress a little more conservatively. She just laughed it off and told me that looking good helped bring in more tips. She even joked that maybe her outfits would get me more interested in romance. The restaurant's owner was a decent guy, ran the place well, and treated his employees fairly. His whole family worked there, too. His son, though, was a different story. A bit of an arrogant jerk, to be honest. He'd been born into wealth and had no problem flaunting it. He was around the same age as Lisa and me, and I had to admit, he was a good-looking guy. He was married but didn't have any kids yet. His wife, who also worked there, was a sweet and lovely person. She handled the books for the restaurant, while her husband was supposed to take care of catering and special events. Supposed to, anyway. From what I gathered, he was lazy and always pawning off his responsibilities on others. His main focus seemed to be working out, driving his flashy car, and boasting about how great he was with women. I never understood how his wife put up with it. Sure, he was flashy, but to me, he was just an empty blowhard. Lisa had mentioned a few times that, while he was undeniably attractive, she found him insufferable. She called him a conceited fool and said she could barely stand to be around him. But since they worked together, she kept her mouth shut and got along with him as best she could. They started forming a kind of friendship, though, working together regularly. I wasn't too worried, but I did tell her to be cautious around him. He seemed like trouble to me. Over the next few months, I noticed that Lisa's behavior started to change. She was constantly glued to her phone, saying she had to work late, and would disappear for long stretches of time, claiming she was out running errands or shopping. She also began to withdraw from me and seemed less attentive to the kids. Lisa's always been a great mom, but during this time, she grew impatient and didn't hesitate to hand off more responsibilities to me. It wasn't easy, considering I worked full-time and was the main provider for the family. I brought up my concerns, but she brushed them off, insisting that everything was fine and I was imagining things. Then, one night, after the kids were in bed, I made a move to be intimate with her, and she completely shut me down. I asked her what was going on, and that's when she broke down in tears, shaking. I pressed her to tell me what was wrong, and that's when my world collapsed. She confessed that she'd been having an affair with the owner's son for nearly 6 months. She admitted the relationship had turned physical, and she told me she loved him. She said our marriage was over, and she was planning to leave me and move in with him. She went on to explain that she'd been deeply unhappy ever since the miscarriage, and in her mind, something had died between us. She felt like she needed a fresh start, a chance to live her life in a way that made her happy. She told me she loved this guy and believed he could give her that happiness. I was devastated. I begged her to reconsider, but she said it was too late. She had already made plans to move into an apartment with him. When I asked about the kids, she said it would be better if they stayed with me so they could have stability, and she promised she would still be around to see them. I was beyond shocked, completely floored. Lisa told me she didn't understand why I was so surprised. She thought I already knew how unhappy she'd been, and that the miscarriage had sealed the fate of our marriage. I wasn't just upset when I found out who she had been involved with. I was furious. It's one thing to get completely blindsided by your wife, but it's another to find out she left you for a guy who, in my eyes, was a total loser. I don't want to generalize, but there's definitely something to the idea that some women are drawn to these types of guys. I'm still not sure if it was his looks, his flashy lifestyle, or his constant bragging, but whatever it was, it clearly worked on her. The fact that they'd been together for 6 months without me knowing completely knocked the wind out of me. They'd been sneaking around, having sex in his car, at the restaurant, in hotels, his house, even our own home when no one else was around. It was a deep betrayal, and the hurt ran far deeper than I could ever explain. But after the initial shock wore off, I decided to keep my cool. I figured there was no point in letting myself get carried away with anger. The following weeks were a blur of tears, sleepless nights, and a whirlwind of emotions. My family, especially my dad, was livid. He started saying all kinds of nasty things about her, and it was hard to calm him down. On her side, there was plenty of upset too, but they didn't show the same level of anger that my family did. In fact, I had to step in and ask my father to tone down his attacks on her. I reminded him that, no matter what had happened, she was still the mother of his grandkids, and he needed to show some level of respect for that. Surprisingly, he agreed and even praised me for how I was handling the whole mess. I explained to him that going after her in some revenge-fueled rage wouldn't help anyone, especially not me. We had kids together, and I knew we'd have to maintain some kind of relationship for their sake. Believe me, there was a big part of me that wanted to lash out and make her life difficult, but after a lot of thinking, I realized that wasn't going to help. In hindsight, I still believe I made the right call. Eventually, she moved out and into an apartment with that guy. She stayed involved with the kids and did her best to be a part of their lives. I also felt terrible for his wife. She was completely blindsided by the affair and was just as devastated as I was. She quit working at the restaurant, filed for divorce, and eventually left town. I'd run into her every now and then at the grocery store, and we'd exchange polite greetings. She was a kind woman who deserved better, and I was genuinely happy when I heard she'd moved back to Pennsylvania, remarried, and started a family. It's clear to me now that getting away from that guy was the best thing that could have ever happened to her. As for our divorce, it went surprisingly smooth. She got some of the assets, and I agreed to pay alimony for about 6 months, which I considered a small price to pay to close that chapter of my life. I was awarded primary custody of the kids, and she had 50-50 visitation rights. I made it clear to her that she was always welcome to visit them whenever she wanted, and she did. Things were relatively stable, and it seemed like she was making an effort. Even though she didn't make much money, she always managed to pay the small amount of child support she owed, which I respected. Looking back, I'm convinced that Lisa was going through some sort of personal crisis after the miscarriage. I'm not saying I'm the best husband in the world, but I don't believe she would have done what she did if she had been in a better state of mind. Still, there was nothing I could do to stop it. The day we signed the divorce papers felt like an out-of-body experience. Even though things had remained relatively civil, it didn't make it any easier. We met at her attorney's office, and for me, it was a heartbreaking moment. What really hit me was seeing how happy she seemed about it, standing there with her new boyfriend. She practically looked giddy, and that was a punch in the gut. After all the years we'd spent together and the family we'd built, her excitement over ending it all really stung. It was the only time during the whole divorce process that I felt disrespected by her, but I kept my composure. There was nothing left to fight over. It was done. When I signed those papers, I did see a flicker of something in her eyes, maybe regret or realization. I'd thought long and hard about what I wanted to say at that moment, and I was ready. I'm not one for dramatics, but I'd rehearsed it enough that it came out perfectly. I said, "I'm obviously sad about this. I really believed we had a good life and made a solid team. If you feel like I failed you, I'm sorry. I know I wasn't able to give you the happiness you needed, and you think someone else can offer you more. I do believe that what happened with the miscarriage played a bigger role in this than we've ever acknowledged. When tragedy strikes, people either grow closer or drift apart, and unfortunately, we ended up on opposite sides. I find it painfully ironic that what should have been a joyful experience is what ended up breaking us. But that's behind us now. I wish you nothing but happiness, and I hope we can work together to make sure our kids have the best, most stable life possible." The room was silent after I finished speaking. Her face had gone pale, and there was a clear look of regret in her eyes. I stood up, shook her hand, wished her well, and said goodbye. Her attorney told me they'd send over a copy of the finalized papers. At first, things seemed to go all right. She was living with that guy, and I was trying to keep life as normal as possible for the kids. But soon enough, cracks started to show in their relationship. Turns out, he drank too much, was lazy, and lived off his family's money. He wasn't much of a man, just as I'd always suspected. Apparently, he also had a wandering eye and started setting his sights on another girl, a younger woman who worked at a different restaurant owned by his father. Meanwhile, I kept ordering food from their restaurant. The owner, his father, would always greet me with an embarrassed look when I came in to pick up my order. I didn't stick around long because, frankly, it was awkward. My ex-wife was working there, and everyone knew she was living with his son. Throw in the fact that his son had left his own wife in the process, and the whole situation was a mess. The owner, a family man through and through, once confided in me that he had no idea where he'd gone wrong with his son. I could tell the whole thing weighed heavy on him. As you might have guessed, it didn't take long for their so-called exciting power couple dynamic to fall apart. They were constantly fighting, and it became clear to my ex-wife that she had traded stability for chaos. It seemed she was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't been such a bad option after all. With me, she had a solid partner who put her and the kids first, and now she was stuck with a man who didn't care much about anything beyond himself. She called me a few times to complain about how her life was going, but I wasn't interested in being her sounding board. She'd say, "You were always my best friend. I could talk to you about anything." But I told her that things had changed, and I wasn't comfortable talking about her issues with another man. She needed to figure that out on her own. I could sense the hurt in her voice when she hung up, but I wasn't going to get drawn back into that drama. Then came the night everything hit the fan. She had the kids over at her apartment for a sleepover, and they were supposed to watch some movies together. That night, I got a frantic call from her. Apparently, her boyfriend had been drinking and got frustrated because the kids didn't want to watch one of his shows. I don't know what show it was, but the kids weren't interested, and instead of handling it like an adult, he slapped my youngest daughter for being snotty. It wasn't just a light tap, either. It was a hard slap that left a mark on her cheek. As soon as I heard that, I was in my car and on my way over. I considered calling the police, and maybe I should have, but my first priority was getting my kids out of there. When I got to the apartment, I gathered the kids and told him that if I ever heard of him laying a hand on them again, my next call would be to the cops, and then he'd have real trouble. I couldn't help but throw in, "And this is the guy you left me for?" I looked straight at her when I said it. She didn't say a word, just hung her head in shame. I don't know if she regretted the divorce in that moment, but I could tell she was ashamed of what had happened. Later that night, I heard a knock at the door. It was her, sobbing and clearly upset. I let her in, and she told me she'd broken up with the guy and wanted to come home. For a few minutes, I really thought about it. I still loved her, and we had so much history together, but in the end, I knew it wasn't the right decision. Too much had happened. There were too many painful memories, and I couldn't go back to the way things were. I told her as much, that I loved her, but I couldn't do this anymore. She needed to move on. I wasn't about to leave her stranded, though. I let her stay inside and called her parents. Once they were ready, I drove her over to their place. When we got there, her father met me at the door, and for the first time in a long while, he looked me in the eye and thanked me. He said I'd always been a good man and a good husband, and he appreciated that I'd put the kids first and looked out for his daughter, even after everything that had happened. I told him that, no matter what, I'd always love his daughter. Things hadn't gone the way any of us wanted, but I wasn't going to let harm come to her. To this day, I'm proud of how I handled that night. I put my kids first, but I also did the right thing for my ex-wife. It wasn't easy, but in the end, I can look back knowing I did what was best for everyone involved. She stayed at her parents' house for about a year, slowly rebuilding her life. Eventually, she got a decent job and moved into her own place. As a mother, she never faltered, and I could see glimpses of her old self, the spark, the vitality, returning. Life wasn't perfect, but there was a sense of normalcy again. She went through a few relationships that didn't last, and I think she got hurt more than once. A few times, she'd mentioned to me that I was the best relationship she ever had, that no one else came close. Maybe it was just empty words, but I won't lie, I liked hearing it. Despite all that, nothing romantic ever happened between us again. I kept things respectful and friendly. Deep down, I could have tried to rekindle things, but I was too scared of being hurt again. During that time, I dated a few women myself, but nothing serious. A couple of them wanted more, but I wasn't in the right place. My focus was on work and raising my kids. The idea of remarrying or entering another long-term relationship just didn't sit right with me. I'd had enough of heartache to last a lifetime, and staying single seemed like the safest route. The years flew by, as they do. My kids thrived. They went to college, built solid careers, got married, and started families of their own. I'd see my ex-wife at family events from time to time. She'd always ask if I was seeing anyone, and the conversation would inevitably circle back to whether there was still a chance for us to get back together. I always told her no. There are some things in life that leave a mark you can't just erase. She'd look sad, and then tell me, time and again, that leaving me had been the worst decision of her life. She said there wasn't a day that went by where she didn't think about, what if? She told me that the hardest moments were during those big family events, weddings, birthdays, even funerals. She mentioned that she felt it most deeply when her parents passed away. She said seeing me there, knowing I wasn't her husband anymore, hit her hard. She admitted that she'd never felt more alone than she did on those days. And she felt it again at our kids' weddings. Days that she imagined we'd share together, side by side. She once asked if I ever felt the same way. I told her honestly, it had been sad for me too, but I chose to move forward. I wasn't one to dwell on what could have been. I always found it ironic that she seemed to regret her choice, especially considering how convinced she was that leaving me would lead to greater happiness. Now we're both nearing 60. Retirement is on my mind, and I'm thinking about spending winters somewhere warmer. My kids are all for it, and while they love their mother, they support whatever I choose to do. The last real conversation I had with my ex-wife was at a birthday party for one of our grandchildren. She pulled me aside, asking to speak privately. When we stepped outside, she broke down. Through tears, she told me she had always held on to the hope that we might one day get back together. My decision to move away, she said, felt like the final nail in the coffin, that she had lived with a lifetime of regret for failing as my wife. I tried to comfort her. I told her that so many years had passed, and she shouldn't carry that weight anymore. I had nothing but respect for her, despite everything. Then, almost hesitantly, she asked if she could visit me in my new home. I didn't know what to say. I told her I'd think about it. The truth is, every time I looked into her green eyes, my heart softened. On that day, standing there, she looked especially beautiful to me. The years had been kind to her, and in that moment, I realized I'd never stopped loving her. In fact, at that moment, I don't think I'd ever loved her more. I started to wonder, maybe there was room in my life for her again. We wouldn't get remarried, but what was stopping me from rekindling some kind of relationship? She had made me happy once, and those feelings had never completely faded. At this stage in life, what did I really have to lose? Maybe, just maybe, we could find a way forward together again. I've been spending my winters in the Carolinas, enjoying the mild weather and some peace. To my surprise, my ex-wife came to visit me. It's crazy to say, but all those old feelings, they're still there. She stayed at my place, and we ended up doing a lot together, just like old times. We found out that despite the years, we still fit together in all the ways that mattered. Her weekend visit stretched into 2 weeks, then a month. One night, she broke down, sobbing over everything that happened years ago. She told me that these past few weeks had brought her so much happiness, and she was deeply sorry for the choices she'd made. She said she'd spent too much time chasing some fantasy of a perfect relationship that never existed. I told her that the past was behind us and maybe it was time to think about the future. I admitted I never stopped loving her, that my feelings for her had never really faded. I asked if she considered staying with me permanently. I also told her that while I wasn't looking to get married again, at our age, what difference did it really make? She agreed, and well, she never left. Things have been going great. When we told our kids, their faces were a mix of shock and happiness. My youngest daughter wasn't all that surprised, though. She said she always knew I still loved her mother and had a feeling things between us weren't really over. Now, some folks reading this might think I'm crazy for getting back with her after all these years, but honestly, at this point, there's only love and respect between us. The past? It's done. When I look at her now, I don't see the woman who made mistakes. I see the woman I've always loved, the one who, deep down, I never stopped considering my wife. I think our best years might still be ahead of us as we grow old together. Sure, she made a bad decision back then, but we both lived with the consequences. Now, I'm just happy to look forward. It may sound hokey, but I've always seen our life together as a book we were writing. I was sad when I thought we'd never get to finish it, but now, I'm thrilled that we've got a second chance to keep writing those final chapters. Will she ever cheat again? I don't think so. We're older, wiser, and in a completely different place in life. But one thing I've learned is that everyone is a mix of good and bad. One mistake doesn't define a person. I've got my own regrets too. I regret that I let my pain and anger drive my decisions back then. Maybe I should have realized sooner that she's only human, that she made a terrible mistake. Maybe we could have had this second chance earlier. I think about that sometimes, the what if, but I'm just glad we've got it now. So, to wrap this up, I hope my story has given some of you something to think about. This is the true story of how my wife cheated on me during a personal crisis and how we eventually went through a divorce. It's also about my feelings and experiences over the years and how, after all this time, we found our way back to each other.